All right, hello everyone and welcome. I'm Liza Goitein, the co-director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. The Brennan Center, for those of you who don't know, is affiliated with NYU Law School. We are a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to reform and revitalize, and where necessary, defend the systems of democracy and justice. I'm proud to say that the DC office of the Brennan Center is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. And for this program, we're grateful to be in partnership with the NYU John Bradamus Center and NYU University's Washington, D.C. campus. Now for some housekeeping. Our program will begin momentarily, so please be sure to silence your mobile devices, including panelists. If you need CLE credit and didn't sign up on your way in, please do so now, and please make it legible. We're live streaming this event, and we would welcome you to follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @BrennanCenter. And if you're live tweeting, you can use the hashtag BCJLive. All of the Brennan Center programs produced both here in DC and in New York are on our YouTube channel, and the podcasts are all on iTunes, so you can't miss us. Thanks again for being here, and I'll turn it over now to Rachel Levinson Waldman, Senior Counsel in the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center, who will be moderating our event today.
Great. Thank you so much, Liza, and thank you so much to all of you for being here and for everyone watching on the live stream. As Liza said, my name is Rachel Levinson Waldman. I'm Senior Counsel to the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center here in DC. So by way of background, technology and the acquisition of big data are affecting democracy and justice in a number of ways. Algorithms trained on big data have transformed law enforcement and social services in particular. Cash-strapped governments have proven especially eager to use automated tools. Some of those tools claim to predict crime hotspots and even individuals at risk. Others recommend whether to detain or release defendants before trial. And some assign children to schools and families to shelters. And all of these automated computing tools play a larger role than ever before. So what is the use of big data in social welfare, policing, and criminal justice? And what is its impact on marginalized communities? To tackle these and many other questions, I am thrilled to welcome our three panelists. So to my right, Cornell William Brooks, who is the 18th president and CEO of the NAACP, among many other accomplishments. For everyone, there's a longer bio in your materials. I'll just touch on a little bit for each of them. Cornell is now a senior research scholar at Yale University and a senior fellow at the Brennan Center. To Cornell's right, we have Andrew Guthrie Ferguson. Andrew is professor of law at the David A. Clark School of Law at the University of the District of Columbia. Most recently, he is the author of a book, which I believe is displayed right there, The Rise of Big Data Policing, Surveillance, Race, and the Future of Law Enforcement. And I just learned that it won the Prose Award for Best Scholarly Legal Book of 2017. Which is fantastic, indeed. And as you probably saw, copies are available for sale upstairs. Andrew will be signing them. And then to Andrew's right is Tamika Lewis. Tamika is an organizer at Our Data Bodies, which seeks to clarify the ways digital information is collected, stored, and shared by government and corporations in communities in Charlotte, North Carolina, Detroit, and LA. And the project is analyzing how different data systems impact reentry, fair housing, public assistance, and community development. So welcome, Cornell, Andrew, and Tamika, to the Brennan Center for Justice and to NYU and DC. So I want to kick off the discussion by turning to Andrew. So you recently published this book on surveillance policing and big data, and you refer to black data. So black data is kind of a play on words. So the idea being that the data is shrouded in secrecy, so a little bit like a black box, and also that it has disproportionate impacts on communities of color. I would love to hear a little bit about sort of what you found in your research and writing about how data is being used and what some of the consequences are.
Sure, and thank you all for being here. I want to ground it in a particular technology in a particular place. Person-based predictive policing in Chicago, Illinois. Right now in Chicago, the Chicago Police Department is using an algorithm to define and describe and identify individuals they believe are most at risk for violence. At risk either because they will be the perpetrator of violence, the shooter, or they will be the victim of violence, the person who is shot. If you make this list, you may get a knock on the door from a Chicago detective or police officer to tell you you've made this list. In fact, they have a letter with your name on it and why they think you are at risk. From one perspective, it is kind of a public health approach to violence, recognizing and intervening at people who are at risk. On the other hand, it becomes sort of a data-driven most wanted list. So police have a shorthand way of finding the people they think might be suspects. You might ask, how do you get on this list? Well, it is a secret algorithm. The algorithm is still secret, but we know the inputs. The inputs involve arrests, past arrests for violence, weapons offenses, or narcotics. Whether you were the victim of a shooting or another violent act, the age at the last arrest, younger the age, higher the risk score, and kind of the trend line, is this going up or down, are you aging out or not? You might ask, who ends up on this list? Perhaps not, or unsurprisingly, it is primarily young men of color, and almost all from poor communities in Chicago. How you might ask, how do you get off this list? Well, you don't get off this list necessarily, although the scores keep changing, and they have real impacts. Because if you are stopped by a Chicago police officer, literally this threat score from 1 to 500 plus shows up on like the computer dashboard of the computer, like in the patrol car, and they can see that they have just stopped an individual with 482 or a 500 plus or a 2 or whatever it would be. And obviously that's going to impact how that officer sort of treats this individual as a person or as a suspect. Might impact use of force. It might impact suspicion about whether you believe this person is suspicious. And all that brings up this idea of black data. Black data is my sort of combination of taking this idea that we're talking about a black box. The algorithm is secret. We're talking about race and how the racial data is encoded. One of the realities of using arrests as part of your inputs is that if you study policing, you know that arrests correlate more with where police are and what police are doing. There are other sort of factors, maybe calls for service and other things that could change that. But arrests, generally speaking, track where police go. And the reality is, in a city like Chicago, that the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division did an in-depth study to find that there were systemic, endemic, and really problematic racial issues in the police department. Those arrests and those inputs are going to impact the outcome, right? And finally, it's going to be distorting to our constitutional law. Our Fourth Amendment, our protections of all of us on the streets, were created in an age of small data. It was not in a world where even an officer had to deal with these new inputs or how to interpret these inputs, right? You're not necessarily given a whole lot of information about how you're supposed to take a 482 threat score. What does that mean? How do you evaluate it? And so all of these technologies are currently playing out, and they're just one of the many technologies I talked about in the book, but they have real distorting impacts on how police do their jobs, who they target, where they go, and how they investigate crimes. And so it is one aspect of sort of an example of what I see as the problems of black data policing.
That's great. Thank you. That was such a great encapsulation. And I especially love that phrase, the distorting impacts on how police do their jobs. I feel like there's a lot more to unpack there as well. So Tamika, let me turn to you next. So Our Data Bodies is a national project with a presence in Charlotte, Detroit, and LA. I know that you direct the work in Charlotte. So can you tell me about the work that you do with communities that are affected by the government's collection and use of data, and how some of those systems are constructed that make it hard for people to integrate or reintegrate into society?
Yes. So being a community organizer on the ground, when you're pushing back against big data, police departments, the city governments, local and state, the story that they give back to us or the critique is, show us. Show us that this actually is impacting someone's life. Where's the story? Where's the information? And then how do you actually qualify that someone isn't able to meet their rent because they can't get a job, because they have an arrest record, and they haven't actually been convicted of that? So what the Our Data Bodies project is doing is we're on the ground collecting those stories of the folks who are most impacted, the ones who are more likely to have a 500+ score, and not really because they are more at risk for being a criminal or having a criminal act or being the target of a criminal act, because they're more at risk of being poor, of being a person of color, of being queer or trans. And some of the things that we're finding out on the ground is that there is a direct overlap of when folks enter the prison industrial complex, be it school because their teacher kicked them out of the classroom, because their domestic partner called the police on them because they were upset, or because maybe they experienced some violence, right? And they were actually detained, and the person no longer wanted to press charges on them, but because that arrest record is there, they're still a criminal, so to speak. When they come home, if they did charge or have been convicted, there's this data trail, this invisible information that's given to employers, that's given to social services, that's given to doctors, teachers, and whomever, that says, this is who this person actually is. 10 years ago, they committed an armed robbery, right? But it doesn't really say why they committed the armed robbery or what circumstances or influenced them to make those decisions. And so what we're finding is folks are like, where's my humanity? When am I finished paying my debt to society? I come home, I have a job interview, and it's really good. People say that they're going to hire me, and then a week later, I'll get a call to say that from the HR department, they're unable to hire me. Even if the program was set up through a community organization that is supposed to hire people who've been previously incarcerated, right? So when we're starting to talk about algorithms and how we're determining who is at risk, it's like our folks are at risk. So in Detroit, LA, and Charlotte we're doing people who have been previously incarcerated. Detroit is looking at people who have been evicted or experienced water shutoffs. And LA is just people who are unhoused or folks we would consider to be homeless. We're seeing a direct overlap where folks are saying, hey, I'm homeless because I had an arrest and I couldn't get a job and I couldn't get school and no one was there to support me. No community organization was able to pick me up and see me through, or no family members were there to be able to help me. And now I'm here in the streets. And because I'm on the streets, the police stop me. They wash away my house, my tent. That's what's happening in Skid Row right now. People are literally having their homes watered and sprayed away. Or we go back to Detroit, and it's like, because I have a water shutoff or eviction, I can't seek housing. My children are now being taken away from me. So it's this continuous, we call it the cycle of injustice, the loop of injustice. It's like, when are folks able to get out? And when is their data actually erased so that they can pursue humanity and have the American dream, so to speak?
Thank you. That's amazing, and especially hearing sort of this idea of kind of a trail of invisible information, right, that kind of erases people's humanity and is leading to this cycle of injustice. So I would love, Cornell, to turn to you and have you put some of what we've heard from both Andrew and Tamika into historical perspective. Because I think when we talk about kind of data and algorithms, right, it feels very new, right? It's sort of, you know, modern day technology. But the idea of using data and statistics to sideline communities is a much older story. Is that right?
Sure. So to talk about big data policing, there's a temptation to think about this as a post-digital creation as opposed to proto-discrimination. So when we look at the marginalization, the criminalization of Black people and communities of color from the period of Reconstruction forward. So when we think about lynching and the complicity of law enforcement in the brutalization of Black and brown bodies, literally from the period of Reconstruction, from Sam Holes in 1899 to the death of an Afro-Angelic Tamir Rice only a few years ago. So when we think about the era of penal servitude, the criminalization and brutalization of Black bodies, when we think about the era of mass incarceration, the quintupling of the incarceration rate, when we think about the war on drugs, when we think about CompStat as a foundation, if you will, to drive this zero tolerance policy and the criminalization of a generation of young people in this country. So this is not entirely new, particularly when we think about the use of data in other contexts relative to communities of color. So when we think about the foreclosure crisis, where we saw the loss of a generation's worth of wealth and housing in the African-American community, aided and abetted by objective credit scores, objective home valuations that nevertheless mask and disguise racial animus, where we have Department of Justice attorneys using regression analysis to ferret out discrimination. This is real. When we think about the confluence of employment data, if you will, and criminal justice data, if you will, in terms of the employment market, namely the use of credit scores and criminal background checks to keep people marginalized. So where we have a republic in which we have 70 million Americans with criminal records, 2.3 million Americans behind bars, data is something that people have an experiential and an empirical and a historical reason to be skeptical of, particularly in the hands of law enforcement, which has used data as well as violence to suppress communities of color. So this is not an entirely new phenomenon. It's a new phenomenon, if you will, with respect to technology embedded in a deep historical context.
Thank you. So I want to pick up on something that I think sort of has gone unsaid, but I think it's sort of beneath the surface of everyone's comments, which is that we've been focusing so far, by and large, on kind of what has the government's role been, right, in a variety of ways. So whether it's the criminal justice system, whether it's sort of water shutoffs, things like that. But especially, you alluded to credit scores, right? And there's sort of a world of private companies behind a lot of this, right? So the example that I always think of is with body cameras, right? So a lot of the push for body cameras came after Mike Brown's death in Ferguson, right? And sort of the idea that we really needed transparency and accountability for police, and one way to do that is to literally see what's happening. So kind of set aside a whole conversation about whether body cameras have sort of fulfilled that promise. But that also coincided with a moment when Taser Inc. wanted to move away from tasers, right? It was getting them basically a really bad rap. And so body cameras were kind of a wide open field. So they started building body cameras. They built an evidence.com system. They gave a year of body cameras and free kind of evidence storage to police departments. And so you see some potentially driving of public policy also by the private companies. And so I'm curious, and really this is to throw open to anyone who wants to start, to all of you, sort of the ways in which there's kind of a private industry hand in what Tamika referred to as the cycle of injustice as well. Anyone who wants to start?
I mean, the story of big data policing is a story not of police necessarily saying, this is what we want, technologists build it. It has been technologists sort of pushing out new ideas and many times offering it for free. And as you all know, the old adage, like, if you're not paying for it, like, you're the product, right? And that's sort of what's happening. Axon's like, you can have free cameras, but we get to charge you to store the data. And if you give a lot of cameras, there's a lot of data, and there's a lot of money behind that, right? There's also a lot of valuable information, which still hasn't been sorted out. And what do you do with that data, right? You're not just collecting the interpersonal relationships of what's happening with police and others. You're collecting everything else of, like, who's going to Starbucks, how many, who's wearing Nike shoes. Right. It's actually a really valuable data, unstructured data source that with artificial intelligence will become really powerful. And who controls that data is still kind of an open question about it. But that's just one story of many of how technology companies have entered this market and said, look, you want to do more with less? We can help you. You want to do something that's objective to turn the page from the racial tensions that we've seen, even though, of course, it's not, but it's a good response? We can help you. Yeah. You want to be able to have an answer to the otherwise unanswerable question. Every chief of police in America has an impossible job because they have to answer the question of, what are you going to do about crime? And the real answer to that is, well, we'd like better schools, more hope, more jobs, more investment, and that's too hard. But if you have an answer of, well, I have this new black box technology, it's going to let us do more with less, it's objective, not race-based, we can move past, it's a great selling point, whether true or not. And so we've seen the vendors, for good or bad, be able to convince police departments in cities that they should try this product. And they should get a temptation for it. And because it offers that answer, it's been really seductive to people to adopt it. Because who doesn't want to be smarter on crime? Who doesn't want to have the latest technology? It's why we all buy things we don't really need in terms of other technologies, right? That's just the way it is, and police are no different. If it works, it's great. But the problem is they all have costs. And the idea in writing the book, and the idea of having these conversations is to start thinking about what are those risks, to do the predictive analytics of these new technologies at the front end so that we don't have these problems at the back end, like the question that will happen when Axon, which is now Taser, they changed their name, is going to have some difficult questions of what happened to that data. Can they sell it? Can they use it? you know, who owns it, and it's really valuable. What's going to come of it?
And to add too, on the ground, we're going to use this to keep our community safe, but what it's really doing is actually creating another way that big data police agencies are targeting folks who are on the front line. So when someone like Mike Brown dies, or community members are in the streets, and I'm from Charlotte, and I was in the middle of the uprising, and a lot of my folks, like Glow Merriweather, are facing criminal charges because Facebook was used with the facial recognition software in the body cam footage to target folks, right? The folks who are willing to stand up against the country, willing to stand up against police chiefs and say, hey, actually, we want true 100% of accountability. And what's happening is that the state and local officials are actually putting bills in place that say, hey, actually, police departments don't have to release that footage to you. It's up to the discretion. So what's actually really happening? The police departments are paying for services that are supposed to help create some accountability, some mutual accountability with the community. And the state is like, actually, that's not really good to be really accountable, because then we have to fix you. We have to hold you accountable. We have to say, hey, CMPD, you're shooting black and brown people all over the city. What do we need to do to fix that? And the issue is like, hey, black people are criminals. Let's just keep calling them that, because that's an easier Band-Aid to put on. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that's just deeply concerning to me is when you look at the history of criminal injustice in this country, it's about a kind of collective, communal, categorical profiling by race. And aided and abetted by technology, we now have this overlay of objectivity to it. And not only is there an overlay of objectivity, there's also a distancing of accountability, meaning you have another layer you've got to go through. There's another layer that you have to get through in order to hold people accountable. And there's the challenge of explaining to people what they're up against. So, you know, having spent, 6 years working in Newark, trying to explain to people, this is how the criminal justice system works or not works for you. Now you got to explain what is the algorithm.
How do you explain that?
Right, that's a great point, sort of how opaque it becomes for people. Tamika, was there something you wanted to add?
Well, people understand what algorithms are, though, because in our interviews, folks are like, I spoke to my daughter about getting some Vans, and then I Googled Vans, and then my Facebook ad, there's all these Vans, and when I go to Google, I see all these advertisements, right? And when I go to this, there's this advertisement for Vans, and I didn't even really, I was just considering the thought about it. So they can describe what it is. They can describe, when I click this, this is more likely to pop up. But they just don't have the language. So it's not like, how are we describing it to you? It's like, how are we actually giving it to you in a way that you can understand and spew it back to advocate for your rights?
That's a great point. So I am going to briefly read a reminder. This is really for the folks who are coming in late to the live stream. This is NYU Law School's Brennan Center for Justice program. We're talking about policing, profiling, and human rights in the age of big data with our guests, Cornell William Brooks, Andrew Guthrie Ferguson, and Tamika Lewis. And I'm Rachel Levinson Waldman with the Brennan Center. So I want to ask, we've been talking about ways in which data collection and use and sort of this opacity have detrimental impacts on marginalized communities. But at the same time, I don't think, and this is what I'm interested to hear about, I think it is also sort of problematic to say, well, let's return to a pre-data era, right? It's not, and this really, and also in part goes to what Cornell was talking about, right? It's not that a pre-data era was devoid of bias either, right? And there were ways in which that bias sometimes was even harder to ferret out. So I guess I'm wondering, and this again is sort of to anyone and everyone, are there thoughts about how these tools can be used for good, or if there are ways to kind of mitigate the detrimental effects of the tools so that we actually do get some of the benefit of being able to use data for analysis? For anyone who wants to start. Andrew, you look like you. Go for it.
In the book, I have two sort of positive stories. One I coin as blue data, sort of using some of the same technologies for police accountability. And so a story from that. So Jennifer Eberhardt is a professor in Stanford, and she was asked to sort of just to study Oakland Police Department's tactics to see if there was a problem of racial discrimination, and she found there was, both in terms of stops, arrests, handcuffs, and everything. But then she did some interesting data analysis. She took the police body cam footage And she and her researchers started studying the audio, right? Because it's also capturing audio, to see if police were talking to individuals of different races differently. And what they even could come up with a prediction to guess whether, by the use of language, use of things like apologies or sir or ma'am or explanations, whether the officer was talking to a person of color, or really I guess Afro-American or a white person. And they could figure this out to a pretty high degree of certainty. And they were able to use that to retrain officers, to say, maybe this is an example of implicit bias, maybe it's explicit bias, although the officers were of all races too, but how they were treating the citizens in their cities were different, and that's correctable. It's a way to sort of study, data mine the information to be able to do it. I also talk about in the book bright data, right? So one of the realities of the future and the reality of big data policing is that there's an identification piece of who's at risk, what communities are at risk, what neighborhoods are at risk, what blocks are at risk, and what human beings are at risk for violence. And then there's the remedy. Do you put a police car in this area that you've predicted to be a high crime area? Do you put a detective at the door of the person who's at risk? That is a solution, but it's not the only solution. The other solution might be, instead of putting a police car in that block, fix up the block. There's something in this environment that's helping to create crime. So you could actually redo the environmental vulnerability that's causing crime there without putting a police officer there. Instead of having a detective knock on the door, have a social worker knock on the door, have a community member, have a pastor knock on the door, right? It doesn't have to have a policing remedy. And so the risk identification and the policing remedy have gone hand in hand, in part because that's how we've funded it. That's how we've sort of thought about predictive policing. And I always sort of joke that the problem with predictive policing is the policing part, right? The predictions actually can be okay as long as the remedies are more constructive and thinking about the individual who is at risk, right? And doesn't have to go down that path, but probably doesn't want the social control of a detective knocking on their door, because that's probably not going to be the most constructive way to get that young man or whoever out of their current situation.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
You have
I mean, one of the things that I think about is that communities are often brought in at the end, right? So in other words, in terms of predictive policing, in terms of data, in terms of the allocation of law enforcement resources, we bring pastors, we bring religious communities, we bring in social workers, we bring in young people at the very end. They are not the ones determining what data do we need. So from the vantage point of using data to figure out the allocation of resources, I think it's also important to get the community's input with respect to what the data inputs are. And that, really is a pre-data question in terms of who's involved in the conversation, in terms of developing the questions.
And what the input should be. Like,
That's right.
If you talk to the pastor, like, which of these young men in your community need help, why, and what can we do, that database is going to be a lot different than who was arrested, who had contact, who might be in a gang.
I think we could use this data to defund the police. I'm just going to say that clear and straight, right? Defund police departments. But also, like you said, to pay community members to do the work, not just to collect the stories and to give it back to people, but to be a part of building the infrastructure so that they could feel the ownership that they should have around their communities, right? They should be the ones to decide which community police get to work there, or if community police should even be there, or if they should live there. And that should be a mandate that should be heard. It should not be a second or third or fourth day, and we have to start to erase this idea around tables and meetings or advocating for when people have voices. And that needs to be at the forefront. But also we could use it for services, right? If I knock on your door or I get a domestic violence call, an algorithm should be like, which community or county services we should funnel you into to be able to provide you some support to keep you from reoffending. Not to get you locked up, then you come home and I'm knocking on the door because I'm a police officer and I'm gonna arrest you again without even a call, right? Because what happens when folks are knocking on the door is like, I'm coming to give you this warning that you're most likely to offend, right? And the day of the night, if somebody is in their typical habits in their home, that can be turned into a criminal offense just right then and there, right? So it's just like, how are we giving tools and enabling folks to move in the way that they want to and self-determine? And data is here to do that. Is also, are we teaching the people to read the data? as data analyst, right? They're like, you have Betty Sue in the magistrate's office who is reading these algorithms. It's an old woman who's been sitting there for a very long time that now has to figure out what this number actually means, right? And it's going to be easier to be like, arrest, 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 because no one is putting in the effort and the resources to actually train her and say, this is what this actually looks like, this is what it means. We're talking about my great-grandma here, no offense, who's like, I don't even know how to use this Twitter thing, you know.
I think those are great points. And Tamika, I'm curious to ask, so we've been talking a lot about the impact of algorithms and sort of this data gathering on communities of color, especially. I know that you also specifically work with queer communities, and I'm curious if these play out, if these issues sort of play out in different or additional ways with respect to the queer community.
Yeah, so I identify as a queer person of color, and a lot of my comrades are black and brown, queer and trans people. Facial recognition software, social media is a platform that's used widely, especially as activists and community organizers, and they're also the tools that are used to target us. Here locally around the country, a lot of my folks, even in LA, Detroit, Tennessee, wherever, are being picked up. But what does it also mean that facial recognition software is the least inaccurate with people of color, with women, with black folks, right? And like, this is what they're using to gather us. So it's gonna be like, when we're the front line, who's gonna start protecting our community members when the black and brown men are locked up, and the queer and trans folks, and the femme women, femme body folks who usually hit in the streets running to make sure we rally our power are being policed? Who's gonna be left? And that's scary, especially for me. I'm like, oh.
And a lot of the surveillance isn't just about sort of the individual social control, it's about interfering with association, interfering with protests. And we've seen it after the Black Lives Matter movement in Baltimore and other places, where they were using social media monitoring to see who was there. So all the people who were sort of tweeting out that they were at this protest were being watched and then linked together. And then you can do the social network analysis to see who they communicate with. So you can build out networks of association, which will chill future protesters who want to be part of the next uprising, and will really impact sort of First Amendment freedoms and associational freedoms in ways that we haven't fully thought about as the dangers of these surveillance technologies.
Yeah, and they even produce it to community members as a safety mechanism. In New York, they piloted the gang database, and they stormed a whole building based off of likes of one person who held a gun who was most likely to commit murder, and arrested all of these young black men. And it was like, oh, it's to keep our neighborhoods safe. And when you tell an old woman that we're doing this thing to keep her safe, she's gonna be like, keep doing it. Why not? So it's the narrative too.
I just want to add on to really both points. Just to put this in context, in terms of facial recognition and the use of social networks in terms of identifying whom we presume to be dangerous. When we think about the NAACP, going to the Supreme Court to protect our membership list because we were radical, because we were dangerous, because we were basically outlaws in a society conspiring to deny people their constitutional rights. So if you think about the membership list, if you will, being your face, being your social network, this is very, very dangerous, right? And then the second point here is this presumed infallibility of data. So when it comes to gang affiliations, right, officers misreading tattoos or just having tattoos, misreading, when you think about like who associates with whom in a city like Newark that's relatively small, geographically compact, this notion of not affiliating with the gang is just completely ridiculous. This is a problem because we're essentially criminalizing categorically communities and races and ethnicities, aided and abetted by technology. And that's a very, very serious danger.
And can I ask, I was going to ask a different question, but sort of following up on that, is there anything that you can say about, you know, there was this report, right, that was released, this FBI report about this category of black identity extremists, right, which really like brings us to a point, the very notion of criminalizing a community. And Cornell, I don't know if there's any background that you want to give on that, right, because it really, I mean, it kind of surfaces all of this in a very explicit way.
I'm sure we could each speak to this, but I would just simply say, flying around the country, meeting young people at 2 o'clock in the morning, 1 o'clock in the morning, in cities all across the country. At that hour of the day or the night, everybody's a black extremist, right? In terms of the presumption, because you're standing against the police. Yeah. Those folk in Charlottesville presumed to be extremists. This is a very dangerous notion when we look at, well, who commits, most of the terrorist acts in this country? When we look at the history of militia, so this becomes a question of not merely misidentifying who's a danger, but under-resourcing law enforcement with respect to what communities and what individuals are dangerous, who really are dangerous. And to have this kind of rhetoric and this kind of policy coming from the Attorney General is very frightening. Yeah.
And to who is it dangerous for? Black identity extremists is threatening the system of capitalism, right? The system and the structure of how it's working right in this moment. So just like the Black Panther Party did, we're going to start feeding our own folks. We're going to start providing breakfast programs. We're going to give sickle cell anemia shots to our community members, our Oches Avenue in Philly, right? The MOVE folks. We're going to burn them down because they are self-sustaining and they do not want to opt into capitalism. They don't want to opt into this slave labor of how this country is set up. And so anyone who is against that, anyone in this room, if you believe that Black Lives Matter, which you all should, you're a Black identity extremist. And I think that, what is the narrative piece that, I am that, right? Because I stand for my rights. And when Black people get free, we will all get free, whether it's immigrants, migrants, low-wage workers, Black women, brown women, femme folks, right? Queer, trans folks, people in this room. It's like we all have that identity. And if we start to be like, listen, I'm a Black identity extremist, and started showing the wide span of who all of that entails, they will see that they're actually the minority and wanting to keep capitalism alive.
And just the ease of how surveillance can use, so all of you who just heard that discussion, who now can be tracked to being here by your phones and your Twitter accounts that you're just putting out, right, are now part of this network. So when the FBI is to see who are the seditious people who would show up to come listen about this book, you are now a part of it. And that's how easy it is to track. And it might cause you, well, maybe I don't want to go see Andrew's next book talk because I could be tracked again. Or and that has a chilling impact in the seriousness way of trying to recognize that if you believe in dissent and if you believe that people can have different ideas against the government, or in fact are encouraged to have that, this kind of tracking and then labeling, and then using that labeling as a justification to redirect police resources is really troubling.
Well, and to that point, and also picking up on one of the points that Tamika made, but generally this idea of sort of labeling and grouping people together, you had mentioned, the idea of sort of, there's a Facebook like, and then what does that lead to, right? Sort of like whole buildings of people being arrested. And it's one of the things that we know, right? That simply liking a picture or liking a video that depicts somebody who is in a gang or is wearing clothes that are sort of taken to mean they're in a gang, that very action, even if you're just saying hey, there's somebody in my neighborhood, great picture, right, that's literally being used as sign of gang affiliation, which can then be used to, arrest, imprison, indict, and how sort of powerful that is, that ability to use the technology that way. Cornell, I want to ask you, so in addition to all of Cornell's accomplishments as a lawyer, as a civil rights leader, he is also a fourth-generation minister. And I'm curious to hear whether that grounding, sort of the grounding in ministry and theology, does that suggest additional questions? Does it suggest additional answers? Kind of what does that perspective raise for you?
Sure. So one of the things that I do just on a weekly basis is teach a class on criminal justice reform with law students and seminarians. And so when you have pastors, clergy, rabbis who are working in communities of color, with people who are gang affiliated, with people caught up in the criminal justice system, this is not merely a matter of misidentifying people and denying people their humanity. It becomes a faith question, right? Because for religious people, it is hard to serve your God while watching God's children being marginalized, brutalized, and literally dehumanized. So just point one. Point two, there's also an issue in terms of the co-optation of communities of faith.
Yeah.
Meaning when the pastors, the rabbis, the imams are called in at the end to bless bad policy, to sign off on bad policy, or to keep the peace when there's decidedly no justice. This becomes a religious question. Third point here is when you use data to determine who's gang affiliated. Well, given the work I did in Newark, the number of people I know who in Latin Kings, Bloods, Crips, may be more than the average lawyer. I don't think that necessarily makes me a worse lawyer or worse Christian. We as a society have to come to grips with the fact that this is a lot larger than the black and brown they, as opposed to the multiracial, multi-ethnic we. And as a consequence, we all have a greater degree of responsibility, particularly religious folks. In other words, we've been co-opted too long, we have been used for too long, and we have to be in a place where we have to call these folks into account. And I hear that not only from my seminarian students, but also from the law students as well.
So I'm wondering of sort of, all of the issues that we've been talking about. I suppose this is sort of a two-part question and for everyone. So I guess one is, what are the sort of the recommendations that you would make? What are kind of the next steps you would see? We've already talked about some of that. And then the second part of that is, are there cities or places or communities where you're seeing those things happen, whether in whole or in part, but sort of places or experiences that give you hope, that say, okay, people are starting to figure out this piece of it, and maybe that's a little bit of a model for what we want to see happen. And for anyone who wants to jump in and answer first. Tamika, I'll turn to you.
Tamika. So some things that are happening in Charlotte is that we're advocating for the ban the box on a local level in the city and plus state level, but a step further than that is actually demanding that private companies stop requesting background checks. And actually the private companies who hold these background checks dissemble and stop giving out information that's no longer accurate. There's places like in Detroit and DCTP who is actually helping community members have access to internet and to interweb by putting up their own and making sure community members are connected in that way so that they could have access, but also are informing them and educating on like what's the best practices of keeping your information and your privacy and your data safe. And we should do more things like that. If there's a large unhoused or a homeless population in your city or area, I would hope for folks to go and rally with them and act like if they're already here, let's leave them there, right? And let's figure out what services they need to be able to feel that they are included in this community and not marginalized, and that's what's happening in LA. Skid Row is a primary example where they're being pushed out because now the downtown wants to expand and no one wants to see unhoused and homeless people, right? But they could put more toilets and showers and things that would make the area a little bit more neat. Instead, they're depriving it of all of their resources just for face value to push them out. So if you know some of those areas, advocate for them actually being there and advocate for the services that people need to live there and be fine. So those are some of the things that are going on.
Thank you. That's great.
So, my pitch to people is that we need to start asking these hard questions before we roll out these technologies. So if we have these surveillance technologies and they exist, what are the steps before that? And you can look at Seattle, which is a good city example, that passed the most progressive sort of city ordinance about surveillance technologies in the country. And they have pretty much the process in place to start asking those questions. They hired a privacy officer. They have an office that's in charge to try to think through the risks of having these new technologies. These technologies might be smart like bus stops that actually like have the buses go there, or might give you free Wi-Fi, which might sound great, except for well, who controls the data about who's at these Wi-Fi spots, right? And who's thinking about these issues? And so Seattle is an interesting example where an ordinance has passed. They are working through what happens, and it means that before technology gets rolled out for the city, there has to be a discussion, an auditing, a study of what happens, and then there has to be more moments of accountability afterwards. You're seeing it around Berkeley and Santa Clara. You're seeing it around Boston. And credit where it's due, it's being led by the ACLU and EFF and Brennan Center and other places that are pushing out, and Cato, that's pushing out the idea that there are assessments can be made about the risks and rewards of these new technologies, but they should happen in the front end, not the back end. Because too much of the story has been the back end scandal that, as in Baltimore, we're literally flying a Cessna plane filled with surveillance cameras that can watch the entire city at a time and roll it back like a TiVo camera. That was their pitch. But we didn't tell the city council and we didn't tell the mayor, and no one really knew what was happening. Oops, then they shut it down. It was a scandal, right? And so that has been the history of this, that these technologies get rolled out and then they get pushed back after there's a moment of awakening that it's there.
Yep.
And we could change that. We could actually build into our legislative structure, like Seattle, I think is a great example, this moment of accountability ahead of time.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I like that you raise are these moments of accountability that are periodic, right? So this idea of these surveillance summits. I mean, I think this is key because the technology is ever developing, right? The ways in which we use it are developing. The technology gets smarter. We then have to make the community smarter, if you will, and increase the levels of accountability with respect to what's being done with the data, who has access to the data, and then, like Tamika, to your point about ban the box, when the data can't be used, right? So one of the things I think about in terms of ban the box that, for example, we were able to pass in New Jersey, but failed to pass, which was limiting, strictly limiting the way in which data can be used and can be considered. So in other words, sometimes it's very difficult to control the dispersion of the data, if you will, but sometimes being able to at least limit how it's used, how it's considered, and specifying that and codifying it, it gives the community more leverage. And that's someplace I'd like to see us go.
And one more point on that, we don't know if it works. So these checks are helpful to see if the technology is doing what they think the technology is doing. The jury's still out about predictive policing in places and people, about whether it's actually doing what they say that it's doing to reduce crime in particular places or with particular individuals. And so these moments of accountability, as I called in the book, the surveillance summits, is at least a place where the chief of police or the city council, whoever, has to get up there and say, this is what we spent your tax dollars on, instead of hiring more after-school teachers or more librarians, or even giving the police officers raises so they don't have to work overtime. And this is why we think it's justified. This is why I think it works, and you bring people in from the community, from the technologists, from the lawyers' side, to see if you can have this moment of accountability to check what is otherwise just going to be a restructuring of power in America, a restructuring of giving police and law enforcement more power over communities, and certainly communities of color.
And who's it working for? Because some of our systems are extremely working in the way that they were intended to work. It's just not for us, the people, right? Let's be clear around that. That's what capitalism is, working for the elite. It's just not working for all of us. And additionally, too, we have to start advocating that police departments not get any military-grade equipment to surveil our communities. They have drones, they have trucks that are monitoring us, all of these things. And I encourage folks to actually look into your local police department to see what's actually going on. No police department in this country should have a drone. Right? That's clear. And if we could all get on the same page around that, then we could start to move some really progressive legislation to help keep our community members who are not in this room safe at the very least.
So I want to turn in a moment to audience questions, but let me ask first if there is anything that the three of you have sort of been wanting to say or wanting to bring up during this discussion that hasn't come up. Because if so, I want to sort of give you an opportunity to raise those issues before we turn to the audience.
You know, I just, it's really just a concern. I mean, when I think about, someone used to do fair housing litigation, these risk assessments, getting out of the box. Like this notion that people have to contend with credit scores, they have to contend with criminal background checks, these risk assessments. What happens if your score gets out? That's just, I mean, there's a certain Orwellian fear here, based and grounded in history. And that's something I think has to be, central to the discussion in terms of the generational impact of this. So in other words, when we look at the era of mass incarceration, the fear being used to, quadruple, quintuple the incarceration rate, getting people to be afraid of one another, and then adopting public policy that literally debilitates the community. So with these scores that, you can pull up on your, your dash cam and literally assess someone, this is very, very frightening.
Yeah. Well, and to some extent, we can sort of look abroad and see what this might look like a little ways down the line, right? So there's been sort of reporting recently about how China, right, is developing something that looks like sort of a social score for people, right? So it can combine everything, criminal background, sort of credit score generally, presumably are you taking positions against the government or not, all that, right?
Are you calling your parents regularly? Because it's important to keep your community, right? I mean, even small things like that. There you go.
Right, and the idea, right, that would be packaged and then sort of for use for all of these purposes. Tamika, what were you going to say?
It's like having your social media likes be judged on who you are. Like Instagram posts to say. But I also think too, when we talk about having our community members at the table, we have to have some education first and not just assume that they're knowledgeable, right? Because going in blind or not knowing is still, you can still advocate for the wrong thing if you don't know what you're what's happening truly. And that's the key and important part that I feel like gets lost out of the conversation sometimes.
That's a great point.
And my pitch in this book and in these talks is that to think of surveillance as a civil rights issue, to think of it as a democracy issue, and to think of it as every lesson we have learned about the civil rights movement and the problems and the lack of full success is being played out again, just with a different overlay of this data and this idea of data. And that if you think of it as creating the same sort of structural inequalities. Big data policing doesn't affect all communities the same way. It's not going to affect all communities the same way. And so you have to think of it as something to consider as another, you can't say next generation, we haven't solved the last civil rights problems, but another civil rights problem for the future. It changes how you think of it, and it changes maybe some of the resources we get in. And part of that is empowering communities to understand what's being used. I always like to take a poll, this goes to your point, at this moment, in this audience, do you know the surveillance technologies that are being used in your city? You don't. I know you don't. You don't know all of them. You raise your hand. You don't know all of them. But even worse, do you know where you would go to find out that answer? And that's a real problem because there's no good answer there. There's no place for our surveillance. There's no place to go figure out that question. There's no even place to challenge why you shouldn't be entitled to it. Maybe there's a pushback for some other public safety. But we don't even have that conversation going because we haven't empowered ourselves or our communities or other people to sort of fight and demand accountability for these new technologies.
So let me open it up to the audience. There are 2 standing mics. So if you have a question, go to one of those. I'll sort of go back and forth and call on folks. I would say if your affiliation is kind of relevant to your question, please tell us that. And please make your question brief if possible, and definitely include an actual question.
Thank you.
So I'll go here first.
Very good. I'd like to frame my question by suggesting that data collection, intelligence gathering, these are key aspects of waging war. I just want to suggest that. My name is Edward D. Sargent, former Washington Post reporter, former spokesman for the local prison system. I've seen and observed the system from the outside objectively, and I've been in the system, helping the system to correct the behaviors that lead to this incarceration. Now, I got a question for the panel. First of all, just to get this out the way, if you've ever been arrested, okay, and the audience, have you ever been arrested? Okay. I appreciate your bravery, and I want to suggest that we need more people in the audience who've experienced this. Let me get to the question. 2 questions. 2-part question. I'm going to sit down. All right. Is the government at war against black people, as you say, people of color, but I'm focusing on black people, especially black men? We can all accept that that's the primary target. So is the government at war against black people, particularly black men? That's one question. And are black men primarily responsible for ending this racist and abusive law enforcement are black men in particular responsible to take the weight of this problem and lead the way to solution? Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to take on either part of that two-part question?
Just briefly, black men are neither the exclusive targets, nor do they have exclusive responsibility. In terms of describing the assault on black men as a war, that is a very powerful and loaded metaphor that is precise and historically correct. Okay? So when we look at the tools that have been used, but it's, again, not certainly disproportionately black men, but trans folk, queer folk, brown folk, marginalized communities are ever diversifying, and the tools of the state have been used relentlessly. And so I don't think we can simply say it's just black men, even though black men are driving this beast, driving this machine. I should say the victims of it. But we definitely can't let people off the hook, right? So in other words, there's a certain inclusivity to the exclusivity now. In other words, when you have 70 million folks with criminal records, over 2 million people in our prisons, an immigration detention system that is also supporting the privatization of incarceration in this country. It's bigger than black men.
Tamika, do you have anything you want to add?
I would say yes to the first question. And I don't think it's solely on black men, but I do think they need to be included in the movement and be represented in ways in which they're not in this moment. I think it does need to be an international, multiracial front, but it needs to be grounded in anti-blackness, right? And how that is a tool that's been used by the state to segregate and move folks away. Even with immigration reform, you don't really get to see the black immigrants who are like being pushed out, right? Very suddenly. So it's like, it needs to be a united front because it's easy to section us off and like pluck us off, right? We've seen it happen time and time again with all of our social movements, but it will be a greater movement when we create a stronger front, a united front.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let me go over here, and I think I'm actually, because I see we have a bunch of people standing, I think I'm going to ask the first two people to ask their questions at once, and then the panel can take those two, and we'll kind of move back and forth that way. So the first two folks over here, can you each ask your questions?
Thank you. I'm asking from the perspective of a data scientist. Just 2 days ago, I was in San Francisco at City Hall, so I was invited to participate in a workshop to create an ethical algorithm toolkit for all the agency data scientists and city data scientists. And this is a very new discussion that we're having, and we found that we were a little bit lacking in sort of the legal perspective. We had the basic ethics and the science to make things unbiased, but who can we enroll from the legal world to help us?
Give her first volunteer.
There's a small handful of people. I'm sorry, we'll do two.
So yeah, let's just quickly take the second question, and then we can kind of review what they both were.
Hello, I'm Fadi Nassar Hayat. I'm a criminal defense attorney and a director of the Criminal Justice Clinic at Howard University School of Law. As a practitioner of criminal law here in DC, body cameras are big. In every single case that we get body cameras, but one thing that is going on here in DC is that for every body camera that's associated with a case, defense attorneys are asked to sign a waiver, essentially agree to a protective order of that body camera information. And in addition to any police information of any bad acts that police have done in their course of their career. And defense attorneys almost across the board sign this waiver in order to get their discovery. It's kind of a pay-for-play kind of situation that happens where you sign the waiver not to use this body camera in any other way but for this defense, or not to use this bad information about this officer in any other way, and then we'll give your discovery. In fact, judges oftentimes ridicule me because I object every single time, and they tell me, well, you know I'm going to grant it. And I say, you know I'm going to object. Yeah. So this mentality that the U.S. Attorney's Office here in the District of Columbia has essentially passed legislation. A few of you spoke on this concept that legislation is being passed in places to protect the data. Well, this is a liberal environment where I don't know if such legislation could pass. So instead of attempting to pass that legislation, you literally have the U.S. Attorney's Office making the decision that we're going to have body camera, but we're not going to release it. And if defense attorneys dare to release it to the news when bad acts are found, they will be prosecuted. They can lose their bar licenses. So my question is, what are we going to do in this audience to say, this is unacceptable in D.C., where we're voting 80% Democrat, where we all very much support liberal issues. How do we do these kind of things in a liberal space?
Great, thank you. So I heard two questions come up for the panel, whoever wants to address them. So the first is thinking about this ethical algorithm toolkit and kind of generally work on ethical algorithms, algorithmic justice, whose expertise can be drawn on from the legal community. And then the second question, these practices in DC, which is a very heavily progressive community, how can or how should the community push back when these technologies are being used in a way that don't actually further progressive values?
So as to the first question, and I can do a little bit on the second question, but the first question is the move toward ethical AI, ethical computer science is a real breath of fresh air because it's trying to bring in diverse voices, it's trying to bring in different perspectives. And I hope it's the opening to have more lawyers at the table to see through the risks. I mean, a lot of these technologies are wonderfully innovative. They're new ideas, but there are no lawyers in the room. There are no lawyers in the room in the startup point. There's no lawyers in the room in the VC world. There's no lawyers in the room even as it hits the streets, right? And if you brought in lawyers ahead of time to do some of the risk analysis of like, this is what's going to happen when it ends up in court, and there's a defense lawyer saying, well, what about the Brady in this information? What about all the other officers' other arrests that might be relevant to this case? I'd like that. And the answer probably is, we don't actually even know how to get that for you because we didn't design the system that way. That problem might be identified and not solved, but at least addressed beforehand. It's how you design, it's how you engineer. And we need to have more voices in there. Voices both communities of color, which are not, unfortunately, in all the computer science classes of America, not many lawyers that sort of overlap. Yeah. And so I think it's a really important question. As to how you litigate it, I think you need to be talking to some of the folks who are doing the engineering of the body cams and saying, what is the reason why that you're not allowed to it? I think you need to litigate it. There's going to be some lawyers who have to explain to judges, why this is unfair restriction on their information. So I think it's a challenge to do, and I think hopefully people in this audience will listen to your call.
Does anyone else? Yeah, Tamika.
I just have something for the second part. I think y'all can't release it, but there's always some loopholes around how information can and can't get out. And having more folks who are willing to stand there and be like, actually, this is what you need. This is how you put a FOIA request in. This is the specific information that you should be asking for. These are the right questions that you should be asking. You don't have to be the one handing over the video cam, but you could also be the one shooing someone along on the right steps to take, so that way they can collect their own data to create a case. Like, we've asked for this many body cam footage, and this is how many times we've been denied, right? And these are the legislators who support this bill, and when election cycles come around, like some of us are in one now, I know Charlotte, the legislator is up, right? Calling those people and demanding that they be accountable, or that we have the power to remove them, and we will remove them. And start to hone back on that narrative piece, but also shoot them along and direct them to where they should go.
That's a great point. So let me I think there's two folks here standing, so why don't we take both of these questions at once?
Thank you for holding this panel. You all effectively refuted what you called seductive argument that data analytics is currently being used by the police to enforce objectivity in policing and to protect marginalized communities. And Tamika, you even pointed specifically at the concept that, we should maybe one solution to this is to defund police departments entirely. While the abolishment of police departments does seem to solve the problem of a world where police departments and big data have to find some working relationship, I'm wondering if you as a panel consider that to be the only solution. In other words, can you imagine any big data analytics tools that could be used in the hands of a police department to moderate discrimination and improve on a world where police are completely untraceable and therefore not possible to be held accountable?
Okay, thank you. And then your question.
Good evening. Since you said I should identify myself first, it's going to be like a shameless plug. My name is Netfa Freeman. I'm host and producer of the radio program Voices with Vision on WPFW in Washington, D.C. Airs every Tuesday at 9 a.m. My question is concerning, one, you mentioned, and I appreciate that you mentioned the FBI's Black Identity Extremist designation, and I don't know how many people are also aware that same counterterrorism division of the FBI earlier, maybe a decade prior to this or later, also discovered that white supremacist organizations have infiltrated law enforcement at every level. And so I was wondering if any of the panelists had any thoughts on how this, what we're talking about today, could impact in terms of the policing aspect of it, how this also exposes or makes available to this aspect, I mean, white supremacists in that way, and what might you suggest in terms of how it might impact those things. That's that.
And how it might impact those things in terms of white supremacist involvement? Right,
and their operations and whatnot. Clearly, you know, that's not something that the country's really doing anything about. They'll put out Black Identity Extremists before they talk about some kind of counter, you know.
Right. Okay, well, thank you. So,
why would they do that?
You know, when Chicago did its, when the Civil Rights Division, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division did its investigation into Chicago's police department, they actually searched some of the officers' like social media profiles. And they used sort of big data trails to find like racist comments and offensive comments and derogatory comments to different religions. And so, you know, the same data trails that can be turned and reveal whatever patterns, activities you think are happening can also be used on law enforcement, right? It's actually really hard to get away with your groups and your identities if you wanted to turn the architecture of surveillance against police, and that can happen. And as to the first question about can this be used, like, so my book is not an attack on big data policing, it's a caution. It's a saying that these risks are identifiable and solvable, but there can be some use of this, and we need to address it because there's going to be use of it, right? Whether for good or not, we're not going to get rid of police, I don't think. We're not going to get rid of big data, and so let's try to think of ways to work through and see some of these risks ahead of time, because we're at the really early stage of this development of the technology, right? We're at the infancy of it, and it's going to change, it's going to evolve, and maybe we can try to like raise it well, I don't know if it's the wrong metaphor now, but do it in a way where we can foresee some of these risks and moderate it. And that's not quite as extreme. You may disagree, and I understand why, but I think that there is room for a little hope.
Yeah, I just want to start by saying ending police state is not an extreme idea. It's imaginative thought, but it's not extreme. And I think to go back to the first question and kind of what you said is that if we turn this software and this data mining onto the police departments to attack and target the white supremacists who are hiding in the belly of the beast, to move them out, then maybe we could start to talk about how we can keep police departments, and I'm not advocating for this, in communities, right? If they wanted to do that internal work. But we have to start with why the police departments were made and created in the first place. It wasn't to protect the community, that's false. It was to protect white and elite property, right? From the poor folks in the street of Manhattan and downtown New York, right? So it's not for the people we serve, it's for the elite we serve, and they're really doing it really, 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 really well. So I just wanted to be clear. But I think we could turn the software. And I don't think that systems, algorithms, or this data system can be unbiased if people who are not impacted by these systems in the room. And like the brother just asked who was arrested, right? Like even in this panel, you're like, I could be there, I could be the lawyer to like start advocating for this, but you've never been arrested. So what does that actually mean? Until folks have access to those rooms and those conversations, how are we creating them? That is like the unbiased spectrum is like, really, 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 really biased and the least amount of bias, but it's never going to be zero.
Yeah.
I mean, to the question of what the infiltration of white supremacists in law enforcement, we've never done a robust survey of the degree to which that is true, and we know it to be true. With respect to hate crimes, the data that we collect on hate crimes is voluntary and unreliable, and it underreports. With respect to the use of data, big data, in terms of policing, I agree with you that it's going to be used. We are in its infancy, but we have to put in place protections that are protections as in red light and green light, i.e. you don't go forward unless the protections are sufficient and clear and transparent for the community. If that cannot be demonstrated, you can't go forward. That has to be the community's position, as opposed to trust us.
We got your back.
Right, we got your back. It'll all work out. Because as students of history, we know it won't work out. And that this will operate to our detriment. We've been through the war on drugs. We've been through zero tolerance. We understand CompStat. We know where this is going to go. And so I think that just has to be our position, that unless you can assure us that this won't operate to our detriment, we cannot sign off on this, and that we're categorically opposed to it.
So we are starting to run out of time, but I really want to give folks a chance to ask questions. So we'll take 2 questions here, and I would just ask you to get to the question piece as quickly as possible.
Okay. Hello, my name is Jesse Wu, concerned citizen, but in a previous life I was a researcher at Georgia Tech studying privacy and cybersecurity law and policy, working on smart cities. And so I'm curious, New York City has an ordinance about AI discrimination. That they've established a committee to do, specifically to run audits of these black box systems. And so curious if any of you have opinions or sort of ideas about how that's being set up or how that's working. And as a sort of follow-up to that, I think Tamika, especially, you've I think, advocated very forcefully for bringing people of color, bringing marginalized communities, to these audit committees. But how can that happen? How do you think we can make that happen? I used to work with the Oakland Privacy Working Group, which they did fantastic work. They were instrumental in passing the surveillance ordinance in Oakland. But it was it was all white people and me, basically, right? And again, this is not to, sorry guys.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And one more question. Actually, maybe I want to shoot 2 more.
My name's Kate Wada. I am particularly interested in the ways that big data intersects with immigrant communities, and the way that immigrant identities are moved through and throughout and around the criminal justice system. I was hoping one or all of you could speak to the ways that that's different or additional than the communities that you've already touched on.
Yeah. Thank you. And actually, let me take one more question, and then I think we'll have 2 at the end. We'll be good. So if you could ask your question as well.
Sure. My name is Cindy. Thank you for speaking. I wanted to ask, I thought it was really interesting that you brought up Facebook, which is a huge monolithic company. And I was interested to hear that police departments and other authorities have been able to get individual level data off of Facebook, because they do try not to release that, but obviously there are ways around it. And so I was wondering what the current legal restrictions are on finding individual level data off of Facebook and Twitter, and if there have been any cities that have put in responsible regulations around that, or at what level of government do those regulations need to occur? Like, does it need to be national? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are great questions. So let me just run through them quickly. The first was about an algorithmic transparency bill that recently passed in New York City. And I will just add one caveat to that, which is that the bill as originally proposed set up a task force that was actually going to engage in auditing. The bill as passed just sets up the task force, really. And the task force does some study, but then in terms of actually acting on anything, there was a lot that was stripped out of the bill, unfortunately. But it does set up this task force, which is important. How can communities be involved in that auditing process? what's the intersection of big data and immigrant communities? Are these issues playing out in different or additional ways in immigrant communities? And then what does the legal sort of structure look like in terms of access to Facebook data, which I guess could mean either kind of data that's public on Facebook or actually getting like somebody's communications, like very specific information from Facebook. So with all of those, who wants to take a piece of that first?
I could start with the first two.
Sure.
In regards to the community-based auditing, we have to stop thinking of how we're going to get the community to the small little tiny table and how we're going to get the 6 or 7, 8, 10 people who are sitting at that table to do some organizing one-on-one and start going into the communities and doing some door knockings, or at least putting up a budget that will employ folks to be able to collect that data and that information. It can't be the other way around. As a single mother, I am not going to your meeting at 6 o'clock to talk about something that I have no concern with or interest. But if you come to my house for 20 minutes, I can entertain your conversation. So we have to just start switching that frame. And around the immigrant reform, I could just speak to Charlotte around how data is working. So folks are getting arrested and detained because police officers are setting up checkpoints in high poverty areas, right? And what they're looking for is people who don't have licenses, who are most likely people with felonies or people who don't have citizenship in this country, and then they're detaining them. And whether or not they have a 287G agreement in your city, which means that your local police department won't communicate with ICE and send those fingerprints along, is something that just is unique to each place. But in Charlotte, we don't have one. So which means that they pick them up, they run your fingerprints through the system, and you may be good to go. But if you don't have citizenships, now you're in the court. Oh, you can go off, you're free to go. And then ICE is coming to detain you. And then they're being sent to detention centers on which we're losing people in the shift around, we can't find or locate these people. And that is, I thank you for bringing that up, because that's something that we have to start paying attention to, because there is a direct pipeline to those things.
So in New York, one of the original proposals was to actually do this algorithmic sort of study of NYPD. Dan Grodnick, who was a city councilman, brought that up as a bill, and it was completely defeated, and there was NYPD went after him for suggesting that. And I don't even think the task force is necessarily looking at policing. Let's look at the other sort of city services. And I forgot to give a shout out to Oakland, who actually did do a real surveillance ordinance like Seattle did. In terms of Facebook and content, if that's what we're talking about, individual content, generally speaking, Facebook has said you need a warrant to get individual content, but a lot of times law enforcement can get a warrant if they think people are involved in things. We'll see if the Supreme Court decides that Carpenter case, whether third-party records will be open or not or require these things, but that's an open question. But the companies are actually the ones pushing back in many ways because the legislative, federal and state, or federal in most states, so some states that have acted, like California, have generally not been terribly active or proactive about protecting all of our data. And finally, about immigration, I think that we are seeing, even in the last 6 weeks to 8 weeks, a shift in how big data policing is being used. The story of big data policing has so far been a fragmented sort of local story. What LA is doing is not what Philly is doing. What Chicago is doing is not what Washington's doing. But watching how this government and this federal government is starting to target people who are perceived immigration violators using automated license plate readers, using facial scans at borders, using social media. They have a proposal out for social media searches to determine if you'll be a good immigrant or bad. I don't really understand it. But you guys have been working on it, right? You actually are expert. She's the expert on it. But the reality is we're starting to see these same technologies being used on the next other. Not that they weren't always the other, but like another other. And that is a different move because suddenly it's federalized. And there's more money and there's more danger.
So, and I'm happy to talk more after this also about social media, sort of use of social media, use of Facebook data, things like that. I think it's really interesting. It's something we've been doing a lot of work on. And I will say a very quick pitch in terms of the idea of especially like big data in immigrant communities. So we've been doing a lot of work with a lot of other organizations, Georgetown's Center on Privacy and Technology, a lot of allied organizations on this thing that had been called the Extreme Vetting Initiative. The name is kind of changing, but the idea is that ICE wants to use internet monitoring, so monitoring of social media, internet sites generally, academic websites, to make these determinations, both for people who are applying for visas and for people who are in the country. They want to do something called continuous monitoring of whether people are going to make positive contributions to society or to the national interest, and also whether they're likely to commit a crime or terrorist act. There are so many issues with this. I'm happy to talk about it more afterwards, and I would also say for anyone who's interested, I would direct you to the Brennan Center's site. If you Google Brennan Center ICE Extreme Vetting Initiative resource page, we have a page with talking points about it, letters that have been sent to DHS. We're doing a lot of advocacy on this because it's a huge issue for all of the reasons that everyone has been covering. So we're just about out of time, but we have 2 more questions, which is perfect. So I'll go to you first, and then you, and if you can just make them brief, that's great. We'll answer them, and then we'll be just about done.
Sure. I'm Josh. So this is, I know we've been talking tonight a lot about problems, and the problem's big, and I think it all comes back to structural power. So I know the lab here in the DC government did that recent study of the police body cameras, and they found, as I understand it, that they did not deter. This is someone that does data-driven policy recommendations is what they do. And they did this study and found it did not deter police misconduct, as I understand it. Now, why that is, what I heard from somebody, which I thought was interesting, is, well, yeah, it doesn't stop someone from doing something if there are no repercussions. Right. It takes a lot to get fired from the force or to be seriously disciplined. So that's number one. Number two is to you guys were talking about bringing in people earlier into the process of developing these things. So you got data inputs.
And I apologize, I have to ask you to get to the question only because I know we're just about to run out of time.
How do you get that to happen in a bias system?
How do you get the accountability to happen?
To get the people involved earlier if the people currently there don't want them there.
Okay. Okay, that's a great question. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for talking. My name is Soraya. A lot of my job involves creating regulations pertinent to complex technologies, so I'm particularly interested in the difficulties of translating technical concepts into policy language. So my question is, given that these algorithms can be statistically analyzed, one, are the statistical methods themselves currently reliable enough to vet candidate requirements for efficacy, or on the other side, the potential for this proto-discrimination? And two, is it feasible to embed the requirements associated with the statistical analysis in the form of regulations or laws as a requirements for candidate regulations?
Meaty questions for unfortunately brief responses, but who wants to say a moment or two about either of those questions?
I think I'll take the easier one first. The structural realities are there and have to recognize, like who will be at the table in these things, as you said, presupposes that people would, you need a table, and why aren't you at your home? And the fact that you might not want to go to someone's home to get their input is part exactly, I think, what you're saying about the problem of how these things might not create it. And then if you're at the table and you're trying to translate the language so that people will understand it for everyone else, I think that it is a real challenge because we aren't sure if the algorithms are accurate, because accuracy is it's its own loaded term, right? It might be fair in a computer science way, but not fair because the underlying social structure of bias is going to create an unfairness that we would all perceive as injustice at the end. And having that conversation with computer scientists who speak like you, which is really complicated and technical, and lawyers and communities, is really a hard conversation, but one I hope we could start having by interested people who would come to this kind of activity. And so I hope we can start having those conversations.
And I have a brief response too. I think that we just need one or two people at the table who are willing to make that claim and that mandate, and to stronghold and make sure nothing moves until that is met, that need is met. And like as an organizing tool that I use is that if I can't explain my concept to a regular community member, then I have to evaluate if it's necessary or if it's useful. And I think that should be a rule for everyone and everything. And in this case, it has to be multilingual, right? It can't just be translated into English. And if you can't explain it 3 or 4 times over, then is it useful and is it necessary? And towards what?
To get to the question was on the left-hand side of the podium. So when we look at criminal justice reform across the country, where we see faith communities, lawyers, community organizers coming together, invariably you have the why questions beside the how questions. So in other words, you're able to take very technical issues, whether it be parole, whether it be ban the box, the school to prison pipeline, and talk about not just the technical aspects, but the moral aspects. Because at the end of the day, that's what the people understand, and that's what resonates, and that's what really brings people, not just brings people to the table, but brings the community together in terms of organizing. And so I think for an issue like this, that can be hard to translate if we focus on impact, if we focus on how this plays out in communities, you can get people to come together and organize and bring about the requisite level of accountability.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for being here. There's clearly even more that we could talk about. Thank you so much to our 3 panelists, to Tamika Lewis, Andrew Guthrie Ferguson, and Cornell William Brooks. Again, I'm Rachel Levinson Waldman. On behalf of the team at the Brennan Center for Justice, as Liza said, we're especially grateful for our partnership with New York University's John Brennan Center and the NYU Washington, D.C. campus that make these programs possible. And I just briefly have to thank a few specific people without whom none of this would have happened. So at the Brennan Center, I want to thank Melon O'Keefe, Erica Posey, Manahil Zafar, Natalie Giotti, and Abigail Goodwin. And for NYU and DC, I want to thank Tom McIntyre, Director of External Affairs, and his entire team who do so much work to allow us to use this beautiful space and have all of the wonderful technology that we get to use here. So thank you. Again, please follow the Brennan Center on Facebook and on Twitter. Check out our videos on YouTube and our podcasts on iTunes. Thank you to everyone for being here. And if you want CLE credit, remember again to sign the sheet on your way out. And be sure also to check out the book table upstairs. Thank you very much.
Thank you.